Thomas Provis calling himself Sir Richard Hugh SMYTH, by anonymous. Great excitement prevailed throughout England towards the close of the year 1853, in consequence of the result of a trial which took place at the autumn assizes at Gloucester. A person calling himself Sir Richard Hugh SMYTH laid claim to an extinct baronetcy, and brought an action of ejectment to recover possession of vast estates, situated in the neighbourhood of Bristol, and valued at nearly £30,000 a year. The baronetcy in question had become, or was supposed to have become, extinct on the death of Sir John SMYTH in 1849, and at his decease the estates had passed to his sister Florence, and when she died in 1852 had devolved upon her son, who was then a minor, and who was really the defendant in the cause. Mr. Justice Coleridge presided at the trial, Mr. afterwards Lord Justice Bovell appeared for the claimant, and Sir Frederick the Siger represented the defendant. According to the opening address of the counsel for the plaintiff, his client had been generally supposed to be the son of a carpenter of Warminster named Provis, and had been brought up in this man's house as one of his 210 family. When the lad arrived at an age to comprehend such matters, he perceived that he was differently treated from the other members of the household, and from circumstances which came to his knowledge, was led to suspect that Provis was not really his father, but that he was the son of Sir Hugh SMYTH of Ashton Hall, near Bristol, and the heir to a very extensive property. It seemed that this baronet had married a Miss Wilson, daughter of the Bishop of Bristol, in 1797, that she had died childless some years later, and that he had in 1822 united himself to a Miss Elizabeth. The second union proved as fruitless as the first, and when Sir Hugh himself died in 1824, his brother John succeeded to the title and the greater portion of the property. By and by, however, certain facts came to the ears of the plaintiff, which left no doubt on his mind that he was the legitimate son of Sir Hugh SMYTH, by a first and hitherto concealed marriage with Jane, daughter of Count Vandenberg, to whom he had been secretly married in Ireland in 1796. But although the plaintiff was thus convinced himself, he knew that, while he possessed documents which placed his origin beyond a doubt, it would be extremely difficult for a person in his humble circumstances to substantiate his claim, or secure the services of a lawyer bold enough to take his case in hand, and refrained from demanding his rights until 1849, in which year, rendered desperate by delay, he went personally to Ashton Hall, obtained an interview with Sir John SMYTH, and communicated to him his relationship and his claims. The meeting was much more satisfactory than might have been expected, as Sir John had been party to certain documents which were executed by his brother in his lifetime, which were among those which had been discovered, and in which the circumstances of the concealed marriage and the birth of the claimant were acknowledged. It was useless for him to deny the justice of the demand, and he recognized his nephew without demur. But the excitement of the interview was too great for his failing strength, and he was found dead in bed next morning. Thus all the hopes of the real heir were dashed to the 211 ground, for it was not to be expected that the next of kin, who knew nothing of the supposed Provis or of Sir Hugh's marriage, would yield up the estates to an utter stranger, without a severe struggle and a desperate litigation. He, therefore, refrained from putting forth his pretensions, and travelled the country with his wife and children, obtaining a precarious living by delivering lectures, and he took no steps to enforce his rights until 1851, when, after negotiations with several legal firms, he at length found the means of pursuing his claims before the tribunals of his country. In support of the plaintiff's case, a number of documents, family relics, portraits, rings, seals, and 100, were put in evidence. At the time when the marriage was said to have taken place, there was no public registration in Ireland, but a family Bible was produced which bore on a flyleaf a certification by the Vicar of Lismore that a marriage had been solemnized on the 19th of May 1796 between Hugh SMYTH of Stapleton in the county of Gloucester, England, and Jane, daughter of Count John Samuel Vandenberg, by Jane, the daughter of Major Guckin and Hesther, his wife of Court Macsherry, county of Cork, Ireland. In the same Bible was an entry of the plaintiff's baptism, signed by the officiating clergyman. A brooch was produced with the name of Jane Guckin upon it, and a portrait of the claimant's mother, as well as a letter addressed by Sir Hugh SMYTH to his wife on the eve of her delivery, in which he introduced a nurse to her. Besides these, there were two formal documents which purported to be signed by Sir Hugh SMYTH, in which he solemnly declared the plaintiff to be his son. The first of these declarations was written when the baronet was in extreme ill health in 1822, and was witnessed by his brother John and 3 other persons. It was discovered in the possession of a member of the family of Lydia Reed, the plaintiff's nurse. The second paper, which was almost the same in its terms, was discovered in the keeping of an attorney's clerk who had formerly lived in Bristol. The following is a copy of it. I, Sir Hugh Smythe of Ashton Park in the county of Somerset, and of Rockley House in the county of Wilts, do declare that in the year 1796 I was married in the county of Cork in Ireland by the Rev. Verney Lovett to Jane, the daughter of Count Vandenberg, by Jane, the daughter of Major Gookin, of Court Macsherry near Bandon. Witnesses thereto, the Countess of Bandon and Consina Lovett. In the following year, Jane Smythe, my wife, came to England, and immediately after giving birth to a son, she died on the 2d day of February, 1797, and she lies buried in a brick vault in Warminster churchyard. My son was consigned to the care of my own nurse, Lydia Reed, who can at any time identify him by marks upon his right hand, but more especially by the turning up of both the thumbs, an indelible mark of identity in our family. My son was afterwards baptized by the Rev. James Symes of Midsomer Norton, by the names of Richard Hugh Smythe, the sponsors being the Marchioness of Bath and the Countess of Bandon, who named him Richard after her deceased brother, Richard Boyle. Through the rascality of my butler, Grace, my son left England for the Continent, and was reported to me as having died there. But at the death of Grace, the truth came out that my son was alive, and that he would soon return to claim his rights. Now, under the impression of my son's death, I executed a will in 1814. That will I do by this document declare null and void, and to all intents and purposes set aside, sick in all its arrangements, the payment of my just debts, the provision for John, the son of the late Elizabeth Howell, and to the fulfilment of all matters not interfering with the rights of my heir-at-law. Now, to give every assistance to my son should he ever return, I do declare him my legitimate son and heir to all the estates of my ancestors, and which he will find amply secured to him and his heirs for ever by the will of his grandfather, the late Thomas Smythe of Stapleton, Esquire, and further by the will of my uncle, the late Sir John Hugh Smythe, Baronet. Both those will so fully arrange for the security of the property in possession or reversion that I have now only to appoint and constitute my 213 beloved brother John Smythe, Esq., my only executor for his life, and I do by this deed place the utmost confidence in my brother that he will at any future time do my son justice. And I also entreat my son to cause the remains of his mother to be removed to Ashton and buried in the family vault close to my side, and to raise a monument to her memory. Hugh Smythe 50, S. William Edwards, William Dobson, James Abbott. After some proof had been given as to the genuineness of the signatures to this and the other documents, the plaintiff was put into the witness box. He said that his recollections extended back to the time when he was 3 years and a half old, when he lived with Mr. Provis, a carpenter in Warminster. There was at that time an elderly woman and a young girl living there, the former being Mrs. Reed, the wet nurse, and the latter Mary Provis, who acted as nursemaid. He stayed at the house of Provis until Grace, Sir Hugh's butler, took him away, and placed him at the school of Mr. Hill at Brislington, where he remained for a couple of years, occasionally visiting Colonel Gore and the family of the Earl of Bandon at Bath. From Brislington, he was transferred by the Marchioness of Bath to Warminster Grammar School, and thence to Winchester College, where he resided as a commoner until 1810. He stated that he left Winchester because his bills had not been paid for the last 18 months, and by the advice of Dr. Goddard, then headmaster of the school, proceeded to London, and told the Marchioness of Bath what had occurred. The Marchioness kept him for a few days in her house in Grosvenor Square, but being a woman of high tone, and thinking that possibly he was too old for her protection, she advised him to go to Ashton Court to his father, telling 214 him at the same time that Sir Hugh Smythe was his father. She also gave him some £1,400 or £1,500 which had been left to him by his mother, but declined to tell him anything respecting her, and referred him for further information to the Bandon family. The Marchioness, however, informed him that her steward, Mr. Davis at Warminster, was in possession of the deceased Lady Smythe's Bible, pictures, jewellery and trinkets, but the lad, finding himself thus unexpectedly enriched, sought neither his living father nor the relics of his dead mother, but had recourse to an inamorato of his own, and passed 3 or 4 months in her delicious company. He afterwards went abroad, and returned to England with exhausted resources in 1826. He then made inquiries respecting Sir Hugh Smythe, his supposed father, and discovered that he had been dead for some time, and that the title and estates had passed to Sir John. Under these circumstances, he believed it to be useless to advance his claim, and supported himself for the 11 years which followed by lecturing on education at schools and institutions throughout England and Ireland. Up to this time he had never made any inquiry for the things which the Marchioness of Bath had informed him were under the care of Mr. Davis, but in 1839 he visited Frome in order to procure them, and then found that Davis was dead. Old Mr. Provis, who had brought him up, was the only person whom he met, and with him he had some words for obstinately refusing to give him any information respecting his mother. The interview was a very stormy one, but old Provis, who was so angry with him at first that he struck him with his stick, quickly relented, and gave him the Bible, the jewellery, and the heirlooms which he possessed. Moreover, he showed him a portrait of Sir Hugh which hung in his own parlour, and gave him a bundle of sealed papers with instructions to take them to Mr. Phelps, an eminent solicitor at Warminster. The jewellery consisted of 4 gold rings and 2 brooches. One ring was marked with the initials J.B., supposed to be those of James Bernard, 215, and on one of the brooches were the words Jane Gookin at length. The claimant further stated that, on the 19th of May, 1849, he procured an interview with Sir John SMYTH at Ashton Court. He said that the baronet seemed to recognise him from the first, and was excessively agitated when he told him who he was. To calm him, the so-called Sir Richard said that he had not come to take possession of his title or property, but only wanted a suitable provision for his family. It was, therefore, arranged that Sir John's newly found nephew should proceed to Chester and fetch his family, and that they should stay at Ashton Court, while he would live at Heath House. But the fates seemed to fight against the rightful heir. When he returned from Chester 12 days later, accompanied by his spouse and her progeny, the first news he heard was that Sir John had been found dead in his bed on the morning after his previous visit. All his hopes were destroyed, and he reverted calmly to his old trade of stump orator, which he pursued with equanimity from 1839 till 1851. During this time, he vainly endeavoured to secure the services of a sanguine lawyer to take up his case on speculation, and it was not until the latter year that he succeeded. But when the hopeful solicitor once took the affair in hand, evidence flowed in profusely, and he was at last enabled to lay his claims before Her Majesty's judges at Gloucester Assizes. Such, at least, was his own story. In cross-examination, he stated that although Provis had 2 sons, named John and Thomas, he only knew the younger, and had but little intercourse with John, who was the elder. He described his youthful life in the carpenter's house, and represented himself as the gentleman of the place, adding that he wore red morocco shoes, was never allowed to be without his nurse, and did some little mischief in the town, according to his station in life, for which mischief nobody was allowed to check him. After a lengthy cross-examination as to his relationship with the Marchioness of Bath and his alleged interview with Sir John SMYTH, he admitted that 216 as a lecturer he had passed under the name of Dr. SMYTH. He denied that he had ever used the name of Thomas Provis, or stated that John Provis, the Warminster carpenter, was his father, or visited the members of the Provis family on a footing of relationship with them. As far as the picture, which he said the carpenter pointed out to him in his parlour as the portrait of his father, was concerned, and which when produced bore the inscription, Hugh SMYTH, Esq., son of Thomas SMYTH, Esquire, of Stapleton, county of Gloucester, 1796, he indignantly repudiated the idea that it was a likeness of John Provis the younger, although he reluctantly admitted that the old carpenter sometimes entertained the delusion that the painting represented his son John, and that the inscription had not been perceivable until he washed it with tartaric acid, which he declared was excellent for restoring faded writings. He was then asked about some seals which he had ordered to be engraved by Mr. Moring, a seal engraver in Holborn, and admitted giving an order for a card plate and cards, but denied that at the same time he had ordered a steel seal to be made according to a pattern which he produced, which bore the crest, garter and motto of the Smyths of Long Ashton. However, he acknowledged giving a subsequent order for 2 such seals. On one of these seals the family motto, Qui Capit Capita, had been transformed, through an error of the engraver, into Qui Capit Capita, but he said he did not receive it until the 7th of June, and that consequently he could not have placed it on the deed in which Sir Hugh SMYTH so distinctly acknowledged the existence of a son by a first marriage, a deed which he declared he had never seen till the 17th of March. A letter was then put into court, dated the 13th of March, which he admitted was in his handwriting, and which bore the impress of the misspelled seal. Thus confronted with this damning testimony, the plaintiff turned pale, and requested permission to leave the court to recover from a sudden indisposition which had overtaken him, when, just at this juncture, the cross-examining counsel received a telegram from London, in consequence of 217 which he asked, "Did you, in January last, apply to a person at 361 Oxford Street to engrave for you the bandon crest upon the rings produced and also to engrave Gukin on the brooch?" The answer, very hesitatingly given, was, "Yes, I 999. The whole conspiracy was exposed, the plot was at an end. The plaintiff's counsel threw up their briefs, a verdict for the defendants was returned, and the plaintiff himself was committed by the judge on a charge of perjury, to which a charge of forgery was subsequently added. The second trial took place at the following spring assizes at Gloucester. The evidence for the Crown showed the utter hollowness of the plaintiff's claim. The attorney's clerk, from whom the impostor had stated he received the formal declaration of Sir Hugh Smythe, was called, and declared that he had written the letter which was said to have accompanied the deed, from the prisoner's dictation. The deed was produced at the time, and the witness took a memorandum of the name of the attesting witnesses on the back of a copy of his letter. This copy, with the endorsement, was produced in court. The brown paper which the prisoner had sworn formed the wrapper of the deed when he received it, was proved to be the same in which Mr. Mooring, the engraver, had wrapped up a seal which he had sent to the prisoner, the very seal in which the engraver had made the unlucky blunder. It was also clearly proved that the parchment on which the forgery had been written was prepared by a process which had only been discovered about 10 years, and chemical experts were decidedly of opinion that the ink had received its antique appearance by artificial means, and that the wax was undoubtedly modern. Various startling errors and discrepancies were pointed out in the document itself, the most noteworthy being a reference made to Sir Hugh's wife, as the late Elizabeth Howell. Whereas that lady was alive and in good health at the time the deed was supposed to have been drawn up, and having been previously married to Sir Hugh, was known as Lady Smythe up to her death in 1841, she having survived her husband 17 years. The picture, which had been produced on the first trial as a portrait of Sir Hugh, was proved beyond all doubt to be that of John Provis, the eldest son of the carpenter, and the prisoner's sister, a married woman named Mary Heath, on being placed in the witness box, recognized him at once as her youngest brother, Thomas Provis, and said she had never heard of his being any other, although she knew that upon taking up the trade of lecturing he had assumed the name of Dr. Smythe. Several persons, who were familiarly acquainted with the carpenter's family, also recognized him as Tom Provis, and evidence was led to identify him as a person who had kept a school at Leydime, Bath, and had been compelled to abscond for disgraceful conduct towards his pupils. They, however, failed to do so very clearly. Whereon, says the reporter, the prisoner, with an air of great triumph, produced an enormous pigtail, which up to this moment had been kept concealed under his coat, and turning round ostentatiously, displayed this appendage to the court and jury, appealing to it as an irrefragable proof of his aristocratic birth, and declaiming with solemn emphasis that he was born with it. He added also that his son was born with 1 6 long. Cox, the engraver, proved that he was employed by the prisoner in January 1853 to engrave the inscriptions on the rings, which the prisoner had selected on the supposition that they were antique rings, but in fact they were modern antiques. Mr. Mooring also gave evidence as to the engraving of the fatal seal. On this evidence Provis was found guilty, and was sentenced to 20 years' transportation. He retained his composure to the last, and before his trial assigned all his right, title, and interest in the Smythe estates to his eldest son, lest they should become forfeited to the Crown by his conviction for felony. His history was well known to the authorities, who were prepared to prove, had it been necessary, that he had been convicted of horse stealing in 1811, and had been sentenced to death, a sentence which was commuted, that he had married one of the servants of Sir John 219 Smythe, and had deserted her, and that he had fled from Bath to escape the punishment of the vilest offences perpetrated during his residence in the city of Springs. But it was needless to produce more damning testimony than was brought forward. For 20 years the world has heard nothing more of the sham Sir Richard Hugh Smythe.